What's the most unexplainable you've ever witnessed? Story 1. I broke up with my girlfriend in 2003 and gave her our black lab because I would be traveling. I didn't see them again. 6 years later, I was in a hotel in Jacksonville and had a recurring dream for 4 nights in a row. In the dream, I would walk into a white room and cross it to a hallway on the other side. I would kneel down and call my black lab, whose name was Dallas. Dallas would run out of the hallway and pass right by me. I'd call her again, and she would turn around, come toward me, and sit down in the unique way she always did. Except Dallas was no longer black. She was white. Beneath the white fur were black roots, and her eyes were closed. But she was still the beautiful dog I loved, and I kissed her on the face. This dream repeated for 4 nights. On the 5th day, I decided to write my ex-girlfriend an email and tell her about it. She replied explaining that Dallas had been diagnosed with cancer and was put to sleep 5 days ago. She said she believed Dallas had always wondered what happened to me and wanted to visit me one last time. I cried so hard, and I'm nearly in tears now just thinking about it. Story 2. In high school, I went over to my girlfriend's house to hang out. We hadn't eaten dinner yet and were both getting pretty hungry, so we were unsuccessfully debating what to eat. Suddenly, we heard a thump from the kitchen, and since we were home alone, we went to check it out. One of the recipe books her dad kept on top of the refrigerator had fallen, but it was about 7 feet away from the fridge and had opened to a specific page: chicken and mushrooms with rice. I jokingly said, "Maybe we should make that?" We checked the kitchen, and she had all the necessary ingredients. After gathering them, we turned to the stove, and there was already a large clean skillet sitting there, ready to use. My girlfriend swore she hadn't put it there, as she had washed all the dishes earlier that afternoon and put them away. I thought she might be messing with me, but she seemed completely serious. It was as if something wanted us to stop arguing and just cook that meal. We made it, and it turned out delicious. Story 3. My wife and I were looking for a house, and after a long search, we found one we absolutely loved. We made the owner, Joe, an offer, but he told us he had received another offer just an hour earlier, and the house was sold. Heartbroken, we left and went to my in-laws' house. My father-in-law suffered from Alzheimer's and usually didn't recognize any of his 6 children or me. Out of the blue, he asked where we were coming from, which was unusual since he was usually quiet. I told him we had been house hunting. He asked in his heavy Irish accent if we had found one to buy. I said we had, but it was already sold. He then asked where the house was and who was selling it. I told him Joe from Mineola. He suddenly shouted to my mother-in-law, "Nellie, get me the phone." I should note that he hadn't called anyone in 10 years. He asked for the phone book, looked up a number, and dialed. Then he said, "Is this Joe from Mineola?" "This is Patrick Murphy. My daughter came to buy the house. Sell her the house." He hung up, and minutes later Joe called me, explaining he had played soccer with him 40 years ago, and the house was ours if we wanted it. That one moment of clarity got us the home of our dreams and gave us an unforgettable story. Story 4. This might sound strange, but here goes. In college, my boyfriend and I lived in an old house near campus. The house always had a slightly eerie vibe, but nothing that felt threatening. After about a year, I began seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shapes I couldn't explain but convinced myself weren't real. One day I walked through the living room and could have sworn I saw a young man with long hair, wearing jeans and a bandana, sitting on my couch. When I looked again, he was gone. Shortly afterward, my boyfriend's belongings began getting moved around. Once he left a stack of magazines on the bed before going to shower. When he came back, they were neatly spread out in a grid. Another time in the shower, the water suddenly turned ice cold. He tried to turn the hot water back on, only to find it was completely shut off. He started feeling uneasy, but I never sensed anything threatening. I joked that we had a ghost, the bandana guy I'd seen, and that he had a crush on me. One night, while we were cooking dinner, my boyfriend came up behind me at the stove and kissed my neck. I teased, "Careful, Jed isn't going to like that," referring to the name we'd given the ghost. My boyfriend laughed and said out loud, "Sorry, Jed, you can't have her. She's mine." The moment the words left his mouth, there was a huge crash in the next room. We ran into the living room to find the glass door of our entertainment center shattered, with pieces flung across the room as if it had been struck. After that, nothing strange ever happened again. Story 5. I was taking an afternoon nap after a short morning shift at work. I hardly ever nap, but I had plans to go out for a late dinner with my girlfriend, so I wanted to rest. I lay down on the couch. It was completely silent in my apartment. My ears began ringing, louder and louder, almost giving me a headache. It kept me from falling asleep, so I sat up to find the TV remote for some background noise. I picked it up, aimed it at the TV, and sitting on the floor in front of it, with his back to me, was my brother, Lee. Startled, I jumped up and said, "Hey, when did you sneak in?" He didn't move. I got an overwhelming feeling. Goosebumps all over, chills and sudden nausea. Without moving, I heard him say, "Everything is cool, man. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine." I was completely confused and still felt sick, so I ran to the bathroom to throw up. After dry heaving for about 30 seconds, I went back out. Lee was gone. I called out for him, but there was no answer. I called and texted him, waiting for a reply. I lay back down, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. Suddenly, I felt perfectly fine. I decided to clean my car so my girlfriend wouldn't have to sit on fast food wrappers. My phone buzzed. It was my mom. Lee had been in a bad car accident a few hours earlier and was at the hospital. He passed away in the emergency room. Story 6. When I was in preschool, I had 3 small warts on the inside of my knee. As I got older, they spread, even to my other leg. They would break and bleed from running and playing. By 4th or 5th grade, I had around 200 of them. My mother finally took me to a doctor. He said we needed to come back in the morning so he could remove them. I was terrified and barely slept that night. The next morning, my mom woke me up by saying, "Time to go get those things removed." I looked down. Every single wart was gone. I yelled for my mom, but she didn't believe me and told me to get up. When she finally came to look, she couldn't believe it. She rubbed my legs, checking for them, completely surprised. She called the doctor, who didn't believe her either, and told her to bring me in. When he saw my legs, his jaw dropped. There wasn't a trace left, and they never came back. To this day, I sometimes ask my mom to retell the story just to make sure I'm not remembering it wrong. Story 7. I was working at Sears and came in overnight because they needed help painting the pillars in the mattress section. Around 2 a.m., I went to the break room, which was on the opposite end of the store from where we were painting, to get something from the vending machine. There were only 5 of us in the entire store. I got a pack of cookies, opened it, and ate about 3 of them. Suddenly, I heard a strange noise, kind of like the sound you get when you plug in headphones, but repeating several times. It was mixed with another sound, like someone dragging a weighted yoga mat across a laminate floor. It seemed to be coming from inside my head. When the sound stopped, I went to grab more cookies, but the bag was sealed as if I had never opened it. I examined it for a full minute, looking for an opening, but there was none. Even stranger, I had no cookie aftertaste anymore. Either I completely zoned out or something unexplainable happened. The rest of the night was normal, but I couldn't shake the weird feeling. Story 8. About 3 years ago, while riding 4-wheelers on my family's farm with my parents, we crossed into land that wasn't ours and came across 2 men standing by a pond. They had taken apart an old crank phone, put the electrodes in the water, and were cranking it to stun catfish so they could scoop them up with a net. They kept the fish in a makeshift water pen to have fresh catfish whenever they wanted. When we approached and talked to them, they invited us into their mud-floored trailer for shots of tequila. Even though it was only about 10:30 in the morning, we agreed and had a couple each. As we were leaving, we passed a little girl, maybe 9 years old, holding a large pistol. My dad, concerned, asked the man if she was supposed to have it. He replied, "Oh yeah, she's a great shot." He then tossed a can into the air over the pond, and the girl shot it at least 5 times before it hit the ground. I didn't know whether to be impressed or disturbed, but it was definitely a sight. We left feeling both confused and a little tipsy, and never saw them again. Story 9. About 3 years ago, at the Summer Camp Music Festival, it was oppressively hot and bone dry. The area hadn't had rain in a long time. I was walking back to camp from a show and had just reached the large open field where everyone was camped when it began to drizzle lightly. It felt amazing. I looked toward the tree line and saw something I'd never seen before. A large pine tree slowly bending over, as if taking a bow. There was no wind, and the light drizzle wasn't enough to weigh it down. It bent at an extreme angle and then suddenly snapped upright, releasing a massive cloud of pollen. There was so much that it couldn't stay airborne, and within seconds, about 2 inches of pollen covered the ground, tents, and unlucky people nearby. They seemed even more shocked than I was. My girlfriend at the time had the worst allergies she'd ever experienced for the rest of the trip, though it didn't affect me. I still can't figure out exactly why it happened. Maybe a reaction to the sudden moisture after the long dry spell. But it remains one of the strangest things I've ever seen. Story 10. It was 1997. I was 16 years old, browsing through CDs at a local music store. I picked one by a band I'd never heard of called Corner Shop. When Brimful of Asha started playing, I realized I knew it surprisingly well and was hit with a wave of vivid, dreamlike memories. I remembered sitting in my music room in the basement of my parents' house with my cousin Michael, who was 4 years younger than me, listening to it. We were bathed in red light and both really enjoying it. I thought it was odd that Michael had introduced me to the song, since I was usually the one showing him new music, and stranger still that I had apparently forgotten about it completely. I couldn't pin down the exact time we'd listened to it, but I felt it was about a year or two earlier. I bought the CD. A week later, Michael came over. I said, "Hey, I bought that Corner Shop album with Brimful of Asha on it." He looked at me blankly. "What?" "The song you played for me in the basement a year or two ago," I explained. He had no idea what I was talking about. We went to the basement and I played it for him. I had recently installed a red light bulb down there to make my music videos look cooler. As we sat listening, he insisted it was the first time he had heard it. Then I suddenly noticed the red light on him in our exact positions. I realized we were experiencing the event I had remembered at the store a week earlier. It gave me chills. Checking the release date confirmed it was impossible for it to have happened earlier. I've lost sleep over this because somehow I remembered an event before it happened. I wanted to ask Michael about it again, but a few years later he had a brain aneurysm. He laughs a lot now, but he can't remember much from long ago or even recently. Story 11. When I was young, my school shut down for asbestos removal, and our small public school was moved into a wing of a high school for 4 months. We were told to stay in our section, but as a lonely kid with few friends, I sometimes wandered. One day, I was walking through the second floor and went into a washroom. A terrible smell hit me, and I followed it into a stall. The toilet was filled to the brim, more than I had ever seen in my life, and on top of it, sticking out like flags, were 3 uncooked hot dogs. It was bizarre and unsettling. Ever since that day, I've wondered how it happened. Was it one person? Did they collect it somehow? Was it a group effort? Who came up with the idea? And if they had hot dogs ready, was it planned in advance? I'll never know, but it's something I've never forgotten. Story 12. Right before my senior year in college, my friends, brothers, and I rented a house a couple of blocks from campus. I had a summer class, and after it ended, my brother texted me asking if I could assemble some furniture for him. I went to the house, up to his room, and spent about 30 minutes listening to Led Zeppelin and working. Then my instincts suddenly went on high alert. I felt I wasn't alone and should leave immediately. I stopped the music and heard someone walking downstairs. None of my housemates were supposed to be home, so I went down to check. No one was there. I searched the entire house, locking each room behind me, and confirmed I was alone, though the uneasy feeling remained. I locked myself in my brother's room and went back to assembling furniture. Another 30 minutes passed, and then I faintly heard a door creak open. That was strange. All the doors were locked. I checked again and realized the sound came from the locked door separating the room I was in from the rest of the house. Without touching that door, I calmly grabbed my bag, ran down the stairs, and left. As I locked the front door behind me, I swear I heard a soft thud on the other side. Story 13. To this day, I can't explain what happened. My parents were out Christmas shopping, and I decided to order food since there was nothing in the house. The next thing I knew, literally, like I blinked, I was sitting on the couch eating my sandwich with no memory of it being delivered. I stared at it for several minutes, then checked the bag for the receipt. It showed I had placed the order about 30 minutes earlier, which made sense, but I had no recollection of answering the door or starting the movie I was watching. Feeling unsettled, I looked at my phone. I had 6 missed calls from an unsaved number. I tried calling back, but it was disconnected. People tell me it was like a glitch in the matrix, but I still have no explanation for it. The number being disconnected remains a mystery. Story 14. In 1988, I had been in the Navy for about 3 years on my first ship, a Knox-class frigate, during my first deployment to the Mediterranean. I was standing watch with 4 other guys around 3:30 a.m. when I decided to get a soda from the machine. On that class of ship, you had to pass through a corridor lit with red light at night. On my way back, a man stopped me in that red-lit passageway and asked for a quarter for a soda. I hadn't been on the ship long and didn't know everyone yet, so I handed him 25 cents. I noticed the name on his uniform, Peters. I went back to my watch, and the others asked, "What took you so long?" Turns out I had been gone for about an hour. I told them I just stopped to give Seaman Peters a quarter. All 4 of them went pale, and the senior guy told me that wasn't funny. Peters had been killed on board 3 weeks before I arrived in an accident. I know the man I spoke to was real because I felt his hand when I passed him the coin. Story 15. In the late 90s, my family took a summer vacation to Guam, a small tropical island. Around noon one day, my mom told my sister and me to go back to our ground floor hotel room to shower and change while she and my older brother waited in the lobby. After we each took turns showering, we stepped outside, closing the door behind us, and a huge chunk of ice, about the size of a football, fell just 8 feet in front of us onto the grass. We froze, staring at it. Looking up, the sky was completely clear with no clouds, and the temperature was well over 100 degrees. We told our mom, but she didn't believe us. The next day, we mentioned it to the hotel receptionist, and she went pale. She told us that in Guamanian culture, falling ice is considered a bad omen. We thought she was joking, but other staff members confirmed it. Story 16. About 10 years ago in Maine, my dad and I were sitting on the porch at night, looking at the full moon and stars. We saw what looked like a plane approaching from the northeast, one bright, steady light moving at a normal pace. Suddenly, it accelerated and began making rapid, precise turns, zigzags, and circles, as if searching for something. After about 2 minutes, it shot away to the east like a shooting star. We were stunned. Then from the south, another light approached and started the same search pattern in the same area. We assumed it was the same object, until the first one returned from the east at high speed. The 2 lights circled and weaved around each other, almost like they were celebrating. Then they both sped off to the east, disappearing near the horizon. We never saw them again, and to this day, it remains the most unexplainable thing I've ever witnessed. Story 17. When I was 8, I got up in the middle of the night to get water. The hallway to the kitchen was completely dark, and I was a little afraid. The light switches were strange, one at each end, and if one was down, the other wouldn't work. I walked to the kitchen in darkness, had my water, and started back, feeling a little braver. Then I bumped into something solid, but nothing was there. Suddenly, I was lifted off my feet. I felt pressure around my throat and shoulder before being forcefully thrown into a chair in the living room. The chair slid and hit the wall. Then nothing. I started crying, but no sound came out. My parents, hearing the noise, rushed in and turned on the lights. The room was empty. I had a large bruise on my shoulder. The worst part was, my parents didn't question my story or try to convince me it wasn't real. They just looked at each other and told me to go back to bed. I didn't walk down that hallway at night again for 5 years. Story 18. My mom passed away when I was 19, and since then, my grandmother has been my main parental figure. I miss my mother every day, but if I had to be left with one person, my grandma was the best. We've always been closely connected and could read each other well. She was an artist when she was younger, a gentle but strong soul who always seemed indestructible to me. 4 summers ago, she got a urinary tract infection. Nothing unusual, something many women deal with. I had just moved into my first apartment with my husband, then boyfriend, after living with her. I kept calling to wish her good night and tell her I'd see her that weekend, but she didn't answer. Very unlike her. My husband said she was probably just napping since she was sick, but I didn't feel right. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like getting the worst news of your life, and told my husband, I have to go back now. When I got there, I had to break into the house. I found her in bed, delirious, weak and soiled. This was a woman who still moved furniture and repaired her own roof. I called 911 and she spent a week in the ICU. Her kidneys were blocked, and another night would have caused them to fail. On top of that, her antibiotic was interfering with medication for her low blood pressure. Today, she's in better shape than I am. Story 19. About 7 to 8 years ago, my then girlfriend was tending bar in a small, oddly located place deep in the woods. One night, she called me to bring her something she had forgotten. When I arrived, the bar was nearly empty, except for 2 people playing darts in the lit-up front room. The building was divided into 2 rooms by a half wall. The front had the bar, pool tables, and dartboards. The back was used for parties when the place got busy. The back room wasn't dark. Light from the front and the hallway to the restrooms dimly illuminated it. I sat at the end of the bar next to the half wall. While drinking my beer, I saw movement and looked to my right. I watched a shadow in the shape of a man, clearly defined arms, legs, head, and torso, moving through the center of the back room. It wasn't a trick of my vision. I watched it for several seconds. When I turned to tell my girlfriend, it was gone. Everyone who was there was in the front room. I checked the back. Nobody. The only window was a sliding door with no outside light to cast such a shadow. I couldn't explain it. Before that night, I didn't believe in ghosts. Now, I'm not sure what I believe, but I know what I saw. Story 20. When I was about 8, my mom took me to visit a distant friend of hers. She had a son about a year older than me. While our mothers talked, he and I played in his room. I told him his toys were really cool, and he said I had given them to him for his birthday. I didn't remember meeting him before, but I figured maybe my mom had sent the gifts. We had fun, and when we left, I told my mom I wanted to visit again. A few months later, they moved away, and I never saw them again. 9 years later, at my uncle's funeral, my mom's friend arrived with a young boy who looked exactly like the one I had played with, except now he was about 4 or 5. I assumed he was a younger sibling. I asked where her older son was, and she told me this was her only child. My mom confirmed it. I told her about the time we'd visited and played, but she just laughed it off. To this day, I wonder who I spent that afternoon with. The boy I remember looks exactly like her son now, but according to everyone else, he never existed back then. Story 21. Several years ago, I was playing World of Warcraft at my parents' house in the basement living room. I had headphones on, and the music cranked as several buddies and I were running through a dungeon. Suddenly, I got this really strange feeling that I was moving while sitting still, almost like I was backing out of myself. It was just a fleeting moment, but it left me feeling very odd and disturbed. I quit the game and walked upstairs to the kitchen. It was an unseasonably warm day, and the window above the sink was open. I just stood there looking around and wondering why I was even up there when I heard the faintest sound. I listened and heard it again, someone crying for help. A feeling of dread washed through me, and I ran outside. I didn't know where I was going on their 17 acres of woods, but I ran down the path to the lake, over the dam, and there was my father lying in a ravine 10 feet below me next to the mangled, upside-down remains of the quad. He had been checking damage to the spillway after a storm when the ground under the tires collapsed from being undercut by the storm runoff. He could barely breathe and couldn't walk by himself. I helped him up to the house, and my mom took him to the hospital. Turns out he had 9 broken ribs from being slammed into the rocks at the bottom of the ravine. To this day, I cannot explain the strange feeling or why I came upstairs or how I was able to hear him acres away when he could barely draw breath with a broken rib cage. Story 22. When I was a kid in the 80s, I had a wall-sized wardrobe in my room and a recurring dream. In the dream, I opened one of the wardrobe doors and moved some stuff off a shelf because I knew that, hiding in the shadows there in my big wardrobe, I would find one of those secret passages or tunnels. So of course, in each of these dreams, I got into the dark secret passage and slid happily for what seemed like ages until its end. This is why those dreams were so dear to me. Each time the tunnel would take me to a different place. Nonetheless, these places shared a few similarities. They were crowded. I could only see people's legs, from a kid's point of view. But there were tons of them around. They were noisy. There was a funny smell all around. There were always tiles on the walls, and I had the feeling I was in a very big place, but still inside. I really enjoyed these dreams. They gave me a sense of adventure and freedom that I can't put into words. I was always fascinated by the colors and designs of the tiles, and I loved going around those places. It was fun. Happy memories. Eventually, I grew up and forgot all about these dreams. I was about 18 when I had the greatest school trip of all time. London, my first trip to England, my first trip to a big city, my first trip out of my country, my first time on an airplane. A lot of firsts. I was very, very excited, as you can imagine. But that was nothing compared to the wonder, amazement, and joy I experienced the first time I got inside a London tube station. I think I stood there with my mouth open for 5 solid minutes. I recognized that place, the noise, the people passing by like water around a rock, even the smell. It was one of the places I had visited in my dreams when I was a kid. During that trip, I visited as many tube stations as I could, and I recognized loads of them. To this day, I have visited London many times, and each time I take the tube, for a split second, I feel like I'm a little kid wandering in my dreams. Story 23. My English great-aunt had an ancient farm near Devon in Cornwall. This is England we're talking about here, so the farmhouse and barn were hundreds of years old. Probably about 40 years ago in winter, the family had moved all of the sheep into the barn. My cousin, being a tech whiz, jury-rigged an early version of a baby monitor so they could keep an ear on the sheep while they were in the barn. During the middle of the night, my great-uncle heard the sheep getting a little agitated on the baby monitor, so he grabbed his rifle and went to check on them. He saw nothing, so he went back inside. About an hour later, both my great-uncle and great-aunt heard voices on the baby monitor. This time, they were more concerned, thinking possibly they had thieves or someone bothering the sheep. My great-uncle woke up my male cousins to help him just in case, while my great-aunt tried to listen to what these intruders were saying. Here's the strange part. My great-aunt just happened to have French relatives and spoke fluent French. When she listened to the voices, she recognized them as French-sounding, but not actual French. She said she could recognize some of the words, but it definitely wasn't the French she had grown up speaking. My tech-savvy cousin thought this was interesting, so he asked my great-aunt to write down as much of what the intruders were saying as she could. After a few more minutes of listening and not being able to determine what they wanted from their conversation, the men decided to go confront the intruders with 3 rifles. However, after thoroughly searching the entire barn and farmhouse, they couldn't find anyone. A few months later, when my cousin started going to school at Oxford, he took the paper on which my great-aunt had written down what she heard to a French professor. That professor consulted other language experts and finally informed my cousin that the language in question was a very old form of French that hadn't been spoken by anyone in at least 200 years. Story 24. It was 3 a.m., and I was driving home with a friend of mine. There was very little traffic on the interstate. Up ahead on the side of the road, I saw what looked like a man sitting on a guardrail. I got a horrible feeling in my gut. I felt like this guy was going to do something bad, maybe even jump in front of our truck. As we got closer, he stood up. I moved into the next lane, and as we approached, he started walking into the road. I started panicking. There was no time to slow down, and I couldn't swerve to avoid him for fear of rolling the truck. My friend and I started screaming. Just as we were about to hit what I thought was a man, it leapt into the air and had wings and jumped over the entire truck. It was only visible for a second, but I can still remember it clearly. It had the body of a man from the head to the waist, but from the waist down, it was hairy. The wings were dark, and the feet were the worst. Instead of human feet, it had horrible talons, similar to those of a bird, but also dark and hairy. The best comparison I can make is that it looked like a human-sized gargoyle. I know this sounds unbelievable, and I probably wouldn't believe it myself, but I swear it's the truth. In all honesty, I wish it wasn't true. It was the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. If my friend hadn't seen it too, I would have thought I'd gone crazy. In the years since that night, I've met one other person who has seen the same, or an extremely similar creature. Story 25. One day my mom, twin sister, and I were driving back from visiting some universities in Virginia. We decided to drive back up to Pennsylvania that same day, just so we didn't have to spend the night. By the time we were going through West Virginia, my mom started to get very tired. She called my dad and had him find us a hotel along the way. We ended up getting a room in this weird little country inn. The place looked like a plantation from the 1800s. We all went into the lobby to get our keys, and I kid you not, the man behind the counter was extremely old and giggling the whole time. Before we went back to our room, we decided to get something to eat from the gas station. While we were there, my dad called and told us to get out of there immediately. We were very weirded out because he just had a feeling that something bad was going to happen. We thought he was overreacting and went back to the country inn. Once inside, we couldn't find our room. The innkeeper informed us that our room was in a building out back. We thought that was strange, but went anyway. Out back was a crusty red-painted building. We opened the door and it smelled awful, like decay. There was trash filling the hallways. When we finally found our room, everything was covered in plastic. There were no sheets on the bed and the floor was tile. It looked and felt like we had just walked into a murder house. We got in our car and kept driving. To this day, we have no idea what that was about, but the inn shut down not long after. Story 26. This was in Chicago in the early 80s. I was out with this girl, and we grabbed a six-pack and drove down to Foster Beach. It was probably November or December, and it was raining and snowing sideways. The weather was absolutely miserable, the kind where nobody in their right mind would get out of the car. Suddenly, I had this overwhelming urge to get out and walk to the lake. The girl I was with didn't want to, but since we had just started dating, she decided to come along. We walked along the rocks, freezing cold with wind and sleet hitting us and waves crashing onto the shore. There was absolutely no one else out there. Then faintly, I heard someone calling for help. I looked around and saw a young woman who had jumped into the lake but apparently regretted it immediately. We pulled her out and walked her back to my car. She was shivering violently. I cranked the heat and put her in the front passenger seat while my soon-to-be girlfriend sat in the back. We took her back to her apartment, stayed until she stopped shivering and seemed coherent, and then left. I can only hope she didn't go back to the lake later that night. Story 27. Probably too late for anyone to see this, but the most unexplainable thing happened last year. I had graduated college about 3 months prior and was getting ready to move into my own apartment. My parents had just moved to a new house in the suburbs and had nicely packed my things into boxes, leaving them in the basement for me to pick up. I had a load of laundry that needed to be done, so I brought it down with me since the washing machine and dryer were in the basement. As I started going down the stairs, I was suddenly overcome with a feeling of dread. I couldn't explain why, but it felt like someone else was down there that I didn't know. Yet at the same time, it felt like I was alone. I quickly checked all the rooms and confirmed that I was, in fact, alone. I went into the laundry room and crouched down to put my clothes in the washing machine. Just as I was about to stand up, I felt something slam down hard on my shoulder. Startled, I spun around and said, "What the heck, Dad?" Because he liked to play pranks like that. But to my surprise, there was no one there. I could still feel pressure on my shoulder, almost like someone was pressing down or massaging it. That was enough for me. I left the laundry and ran up the stairs as fast as I could. To this day, I still have no idea what happened, and honestly, I'd rather it remain a mystery than find out something unsettling about that house. Story 28. I didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until this happened. My aunt had moved into a long, rickety old trailer home from the 1980s. It was pretty big, with bedrooms at both ends. The last bedroom belonged to her kids, my nephew, about 4 or 5, and my niece, about 3. My aunt started reporting strange things, sudden banging noises down the hallway, the kids having nightmares about a man standing over them with lines across his face. Whenever I babysat, the kids wouldn't go near that side of the house. It was strange. That end felt unsettling, like you were being watched, but the other side of the house felt safe. One day, I was there after school while the kids were napping. Suddenly, we heard banging coming from their room. My aunt thought it was my nephew up and moving around, but when she ran in, she screamed. He had used a Sharpie to draw perfectly straight lines down his face, from forehead across his eyes to the base of his neck. The lines were flawless, with no variation. Nothing like a child's drawing. He was in a half-awake, half-asleep state. My aunt asked what happened, and he repeated, "The man made me do it," over and over for about 10 minutes. I was terrified. 2 weeks later, they moved to a new place. We're almost certain that house was haunted. Story 29. My father passed away 5 years ago. He was a master builder whose only real love was work. When he wasn't working, he was still working, either in his workshop or out in the garden and yard. The day before he died, he had been out tilling the garden. He had renal cell carcinoma. His official cause of death was sepsis due to the cancer growing through his colon, creating a blockage. From diagnosis to death was 4 months almost to the day. About a week after his death, I woke up to his truck horn blaring. It was 6 a.m., the time he usually left for work. I walked out to the truck, and the minute I got to the door, the horn stopped. This happened every day for 2 weeks. At exactly 6 a.m., the horn would start blaring, and it would stop the moment I got to the door. My son finally cut the horn wires. After that, my father's elaborate stereo system started turning on at 6 a.m., deafeningly loud, and then shutting off the second I approached it. Everything my dad used to maintain, the garden equipment, lawn mower, power washer, broke. Even his hand tools failed. I think he was very angry about dying. If I had ever been on the fence about believing in spirits, that ended there. 2 weeks after he died, I woke up with a pulmonary embolism. I told my mom something was wrong, but she insisted I had just pulled a muscle. I almost didn't go to the hospital, but my son convinced me. I was admitted for 2 weeks, got home, and 2 days later had another embolism. It was such a crazy, unsettling time after my father died. Many more things happened that I won't go into. It was terrifying. Story 30. I was 9 or 10 in 4th grade, and during recess at school, there were 4 or 5 girls from my class playing the necklace game at a small round table in the yard. They would form a circle, hold a necklace in the center together, and wait for a ghost to move it, like a Ouija board. Nothing strange happened during the game itself. Some people were impressed, others mocked it, myself included. The bell rang, and everyone went back to class. That's when things got intense. One of the girls, the one who had suggested the game, suddenly looked unwell, like she was going to faint. Moments later, she started screaming nonsense and shaking violently, as if possessed. My friend and I started laughing and mocking her, saying, "Who's going to believe this?" But she didn't stop. It got worse. The teacher tried to hold her, but couldn't. She was shaking, kicking, and cursing so aggressively that it took 3 teachers to get her out of the room. At this point, I was at least impressed, though still skeptical. My friend and I were curious, so we lied about needing the bathroom and left the classroom. In the hallway, we saw the possessed girl coming out of the principal's office, apparently heading to the bathroom too. We couldn't resist. We started mocking her again, joking about having the devil under the skin. She stopped, stood still for a moment, then slowly turned toward me in an unnervingly unnatural way. She looked me straight in the eyes and, in the creepiest, deepest voice I've ever heard, a voice I could swear came from somewhere else, she asked, "Do you want to be in my place?" She stared at me for a few seconds, then turned back around and walked away. Only then did I realize I'd instinctively stepped sideways to hide behind a bench, and my friend was half hidden in a nearby doorway, pale as a ghost. Later that day, the principal, who was a nun, came to our class and gave a talk about how belief can influence our minds and bodies. She ended by saying, "If you have a strong mind, this will never happen to you. For example, if you are like Fred," and pointed at me. Inside, I thought, "You just made this creepier." That girl scared the life out of me. I'm still skeptical, but I can't fully explain that day. Story 31. I was lucky enough to have my grandparents alive until my mid-30s, and we were very close. My grandpa was a remarkable man, and my love for him is still endless. His name was Eugenio, not a very common name here, which is important to the story, and he passed away in September 2009. 6 months later, I got a kidney stone, a really bad one. It clogged my ureter, and my left kidney started swelling because it couldn't drain. The pain was unbearable. The next day, I was in the hospital. They couldn't remove the stone, but they installed a double J catheter to help drain the kidney. I also had a urinary catheter, and I couldn't walk after the procedure. That catheter was killing me. The pain was so intense I begged the doctor for morphine, but he said they had already given me enough painkillers to drop an elephant. I was still awake, still suffering like never before in my life. After a night in agony, with my wife by my side, We were both exhausted. At dawn, the pain was so bad I felt like death would be better. I asked a nurse if she could remove the catheter. She said she'd called the doctor and left. Crying in pain, I closed my eyes, held my wife's hand and said, "Grandpa, if you're watching over me, please do something. I can't take this anymore." I'm not religious, but that's how desperate I was. A second later, the nurse came back smiling, saying the doctor had approved removing the catheter. As soon as it was out, the pain vanished. I felt like I was in heaven. With tears of relief, I asked her name so I could thank her. She smiled and said, "Eugenia. If Eugenio is uncommon, Eugenia is even rarer." She was the first I'd ever met. My wife looked at me in shock, clearly feeling what I felt. Half an hour later, another nurse came in with a wheelchair to discharge me. His name? Wilson, the same as my late uncle who died decades before I was born. Maybe it was just coincidence, but it shook me deeply. I'm still agnostic, but I wouldn't be surprised if I'm wrong about life after death. Story 32. 4 years ago, my wife, then girlfriend, and I were together in our bedroom. I was lying on my back, and she was on top of me in the traditional girl on top position. She tends to lean backwards when she's in that position, so it's not uncommon for her to balance herself by placing her hands on my legs. During our session, I felt her hand on my ankle. I immediately thought, "Wow, she's leaning way back," and looked at her, only to see that both of her hands were on my chest. I did a wide-eyed double take and grabbed her hips to look around her, but there was nothing there. She noticed I was acting odd and asked what was wrong. Of course, I said nothing, and we finished. Afterwards, I told her what happened, and she got creeped out. The next morning, I got in the shower. As I was drying off, I found a bruise on that same ankle. No joke. It was in the shape of a hand. It was faint, but when I showed my wife, she could make out the shape of fingers and went into total freakout mode. This was in March 2010. Later that year, I finished the basement and we moved our bedroom down there because she works night shifts as a nurse and likes to come home to a dark room. It's not a creepy basement. It's actually nice. Still, every so often I'll wake up after sleeping for any length of time to the feeling of something touching my lower legs. Sometimes it feels like a flat palm pressed against me, sometimes like a poke. It should be noted that I bought this house in October 2009, remodeled the upstairs, and moved in that December. The first incident happened in March 2010 upstairs, and the sensations have continued downstairs ever since. Story 33. When my mom, sister, and I were driving between states, our car broke down in the desert. This was before cell phones were common, and we were far from anyone or anything. It was a bit of a panic moment, but after only a couple of minutes, a truck appeared. And I mean appeared. I was looking down, then looked up, and suddenly there was a semi parked on the side of the road in front of us. There had been no sound, no sight of it pulling over, and yet it was there, and a man was walking toward us. He asked if we needed help, and my mom said yes. She popped the hood, and he started working on the engine. Another man came to the passenger window with a bunch of cold sodas from their semi, which was apparently transporting them, and handed them to us. They fixed our car, it had just been overheating, and then flagged down another trucker. This second truck we heard clearly as it approached, unlike the first. They asked the second driver to follow us into the next town to make sure we didn't overheat again, and gave us unmarked gallon water jugs from their truck to cool the engine every so many miles. The second driver agreed, and we started driving toward the next town. I looked in my side mirror, past the truck following us, and the first truck was gone. I mentioned it to my mom, and she said they must have driven away, but it had only been a couple of seconds, and she would have seen them go past if they turned around on the empty highway. I even rolled down my window and looked behind us. Nothing. I don't believe in the paranormal, and I'm sure there's some explanation, but I still don't have one. Story 34. About 7 years ago, I was living with my parents in a different house, and my bedroom was in the basement. It was a large room with a big bed, and I always slept on the side farthest from the door, which had a lock on it. One night I went to bed as usual and locked my door. In the middle of the night I got that feeling, the one you get when you sense something is looking at you or is beside you. I was slowly waking from a deep sleep, my eyes still closed, when I decided to open them. My room was pitch black, no windows in the basement, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw the outline of a head, no more than 1 or 2 feet above me. I just stared for a moment, unsure if I was still dreaming. Then suddenly I heard a loud whispered, "Hey!" I jumped out of bed in shock, scrambled across it, and switched on the light. No one was there, and my door was still locked. I couldn't explain it. I knew something had happened. I even felt its breath when it spoke. I'll never forget how it sounded or how it felt. Nothing like that ever happened again, and I've since moved out of that house, but I still think about that night. Story 35. I do delivery and installation for appliances and whatever else people buy, so we go all over and see all kinds of places and people. This happened pretty recently. My coworker and I were delivering a washing machine to a house. When the lady answered the door, I groaned inwardly. It was a hoarder house. The smell hit me instantly, and I flinched. The door opened into the kitchen, where piles of dishes overflowed from the sink onto the counters and down into a heap on the floor. A dog shambled up to me, in rough shape but still friendly. I petted him and told him he was a good dog. She led me along a narrow path through mountains of junk and trash, past couches poking out of the mess like islands in a sea of garbage, to the door of the basement. She didn't come down with me, just stood at the top of the stairs and told me the old washer was down and to the right. The stairs were steep and narrow, the ceiling low. When I reached the bottom, I heard a splash. I pulled the string for the lone light bulb, and it revealed the basement. Rough concrete floor and walls, a low ceiling, and a pool of water an inch deep covering most of the floor. Here and there were small patches of dry concrete, but the rest was flooded. In the shadows beyond the light, piles of junk sat soaking in the water. Thankfully, the washer was within the light's reach and only about 10 feet away. I unhooked it, once white, now brown and black, and noticed the drain hose wasn't even connected. They'd been letting the machine drain directly onto the floor. That explained the pool of water and part of the smell. Old washers smell awful when they die. Detergent residue and dirt from clothes stagnate in the leftover water. I was standing in a pool of that, with junk marinating in it. I went outside and told my coworker. He didn't like it, but a job's a job. We went down and hauled the old washer up. It was insanely heavy from all the stagnant water inside, and the low ceiling forced me to duck, bringing my face closer to the stench. We brought in the new washer, but it couldn't make the turn into the stairwell because of a dresser piled with junk. She told me to just push it aside. I did, and stuff tumbled to the floor, but she didn't care. We got the washer downstairs and started hooking it up. From upstairs, I heard her talking to someone, though we never saw anyone else there. My coworker pointed out something I hadn't noticed. On the wall behind him, partially hidden by the furnace, was a large wooden door secured with a padlock. Then he pointed out another padlocked door on the same wall. The hairs on the back of my neck went up. I couldn't leave it alone and told him to knock on one of them. He was hesitant, but I pushed. He finally knocked. At first, nothing. Then something shifted behind the door. Faint but unmistakable. A noise. A movement. We just stared at each other, neck hairs standing straight up. I got the paperwork signed and we left. The smell lingered in the truck. We got ice cream after that stop. Story 36. A couple of years ago, I was backpacking around Europe with 2 friends. While in France, we visited the Notre Dame Cathedral, a cultural icon. After admiring the architecture, we went outside to the courtyard for an impromptu lunch. For my treat, I had a packet of crisps and was munching away. Halfway through, my friend and I were approached by what seemed to be a homeless man, a tangle of hair on his face, multiple jackets layered on. With our poor French and plenty of gestures, we figured out he wanted the crisps. I didn't mind giving them up, so I handed him the packet. He immediately crushed the crisps into crumbs and scattered them, attracting a stampede of pigeons. He stood perfectly still, then suddenly pounced and grabbed one by the neck. He turned toward us holding the pigeon and snapped its neck right in front of us, locking eyes as if to make sure we saw. Then he swung the bird's limp body around like a windmill, or like a rock star strumming an imaginary guitar, before tossing it to the ground. We were horrified until the bird got up and strutted away like nothing had happened. The man smiled, showing a toothy grin, and walked off, leaving us completely stunned. Unfortunately, our friend who was good with a camera had stayed inside the cathedral taking pictures, so we have no footage of what we came to call Hobo Jesus, resurrector of flying rats. To this day, we can't explain it. Story 37. I grew up in Vermont, where every town is small and most roads are deserted at night. One night around midnight, maybe a little later, my two friends and I, they were both guys and I'm a girl, were driving down a back road on our way home. We were going about 40 to 45 miles per hour, not too fast. I was sitting in the middle of the back seat, leaning forward between the two front seats, talking to them, when something to the upper left of the road caught my eye. It was about 15 feet above the ground on a slight incline, traveling perpendicular to the car, and it was pure white. Not see-through, but opaque and without a defined shape. It glided perfectly and no movement, no sound, and crossed the road less than 20 feet in front of us. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I stopped mid-sentence, and as it crossed, I slammed myself against the window to keep watching. It was solid. No details, no shadows, but it had a silhouette, and that was probably the most unsettling part. The driver and I both started freaking out, but our other friend was confused. He said he saw nothing at all. He insisted he hadn't missed it, claiming he had been watching the whole time and saw nothing unusual. That somehow made it even more unnerving. To this day, the driver and I still talk about it and agree it's the single strangest thing either of us has ever seen. Story 38. My high school choir director once told us this story. When he was younger, he attended a music camp in upstate New York, near a large lake. Every year on the last night of camp, they held a big bonfire on a small stretch of beach. It was a tradition, a last night to talk to someone you liked, sneak in a kiss, or just enjoy the moment. On this particular year, the night was pitch black. No moon, few stars. The bonfire cast a bright circle of light, but outside of it, the darkness was almost complete. The laughter and music were suddenly interrupted by a voice from the water. "Help! Please! Somebody help me!" Everyone went silent. Then just as suddenly as it began, the voice stopped. The campers resumed their fun, but the counselors stayed alert, scanning the lake. A few minutes later, the same voice called again, louder this time and closer. "Help, my God! Somebody help me!" The counselors shined heavy-duty flashlights out across the water. Nothing, just blackness. They called out, but there was no answer. After another stretch of silence, the voice came again, now sounding like it was just a short distance away. "Help! Please, oh my God! Somebody help!" The counselors quickly gathered all the campers and led them back to their cabins. Everyone went to bed early, wondering who could have been on the lake. The next morning, instead of the usual slow farewell and breakfast, the kids were woken up at 6 a.m., told to pack immediately, and the buses left by 7. My director said that even years later, when he returned as a counselor, no one ever explained what had happened that night. Story 39. About 3 years ago, my mother and I were leaving the house. We had 3 dogs, and before leaving, it was routine to put them outside. My mother told me to take them out while she went to her room to grab something. I did until there was only one dog left inside, Max. There are 2 ways to get to our backyard, one through the sliding glass door in my parents' room and one through the sliding glass door in the dining room. I picked up Max and carried him to my parents' room, since it was closer, opened the sliding door, set him down outside, and closed it behind him. There's no way for the dogs to open that door or get back inside on their own. I walked out of my parents' room through the hallway and into the dining room, only to find Max standing inside, staring at me with a confused look. I froze, shocked, as my mom came up behind me and asked, "Didn't you just put him outside?" I said, "Yes, I did." The sliding door in the dining room was shut and locked, exactly as I had left it. There's no explanation for it. I'm convinced my dog somehow teleported back into the house. Story 40. It was November of 2006, and I was 16 at the time. It was a Friday, and because it was an in-service day, school had been canceled. I was sleeping in that morning when the dream I was having suddenly shifted. I usually had adventurous dreams that placed me in exciting settings like jungles or ancient ruins. But this time I woke up inside the dream and found myself standing in an airport. I remember thinking, this is strange. I had never dreamt about airports before. The place was busy, people milling around, loved ones saying goodbye, others greeting each other warmly, but no one had any luggage. Then I spotted my stepdad in the distance and started running toward him. He seemed far away and a little hazy, but I wanted to reach him. He waved at me from across the crowd and I waved back, confused. Then he turned around and faded into the distance. I was abruptly awakened by my little brother grabbing me, sobbing and yelling, "Something's wrong with David." My mom had gone to work that morning, so it was just the two of us in the house. I rushed outside to the driveway and saw my stepdad. He had died of a massive heart attack while getting into his truck. I can't explain why I dreamed of him in that setting on that exact morning, but things like this have happened to me from time to time. I'll dream of someone or something in a strangely specific way before something significant happens to them. Last week, I woke from a dream where I was looking down at myself, except it wasn't my body. I had a needle in my hand and was tying off my leg to inject something. I saw dark hair falling in ringlets into my line of sight, and I felt an overwhelming sadness before waking. I was home, sober. I had just celebrated 6 months clean. Using dreams can be common in sobriety, but I have never used that way. I knew whose body I had been seeing in the dream. My close friend Danielle, whom I had met since getting clean. Just a week earlier, I had messaged her on Facebook. She told me she was doing well at the halfway house she was living in, and I told her how much I missed her. When I woke from that dream, there were no new notifications on my phone, but I had a terrible feeling I couldn't shake. I eventually fell back asleep, but later when I got on Facebook, my feed was filled with posts from friends at our treatment center asking what had happened to Danielle. I messaged her mother, who told me that Danielle had been found that morning, having passed away with a needle in her leg. It was a hero overdose. Rest in peace, my friend. You were with me through some of the hardest and best days of my life. I will always keep your memory close. You showed me love and kindness when I didn't feel worthy of even living. Since I've gotten clean, I've tried to nurture my spiritual side, but since Danielle's death, I've been angry at my higher power. I don't know. I just can't understand the point of having this ability, if that's even what it is. When I was a little girl, my grandma Anne, the first in her family born in America after they immigrated from Prague, told me I had a gift. But it doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a curse. I can't help but wonder if I had stayed awake that night. Maybe she wouldn't have died. I know it sounds irrational, but I can't stop thinking about it. Story 41. I live deep in the woods in the countryside of North Carolina. Miles and miles of forest stretch behind my house. In the 8 years I've lived here, my boyfriend, my parents, my sister, my friends and I have all seen, heard, and smelled strange things. The most recent incident sounds like something from a bad movie, but I swear it's true. And I have 4 other people who can vouch for me. It happened about a month ago. My boyfriend, our friends Steve, CJ, and Corey and I were out in the backyard by my fire pit. We were having a few beers, relaxing, and enjoying the warm evening. As the night was winding down and everyone was getting ready to head home, we noticed a strange, bright light deep in the woods. The area went eerily silent. Even the usual sounds of animals stopped. The light was far brighter than any flashlight, and we couldn't hear any movement coming from the direction it came from. Then, all at once, we were hit with the overwhelming smell of decay. It was so strong it was as if something had died right at our feet. We had been outside for hours, and there had been no trace of it until this moment. The light began to fade, but not all at once. It dimmed in sections, as if it was made of many smaller lights, shutting off one by one. Within seconds, both the smell and the light were completely gone. Almost immediately after, the normal nighttime sounds of the woods returned. It was deeply unsettling. Story 42. One night back in high school, an acquaintance approached me at a busy intersection near a convenience store. It was the day I had bought my first car, just hours earlier on graduation day. He came running toward me, visibly shaken, shouting, "I just saw the devil!" He pointed across the street toward a telephone pole and insisted that the figure was leaning against it. I got out of my car and looked. There was nothing there. Since it was dark, I walked closer and tried looking from another angle, thinking maybe something was hidden behind the pole. Still nothing. I couldn't figure out why he was acting this way. It wasn't a prank, and I had never known him to be particularly strange. He was someone I had seen around school, and even knew his older sister. I considered that maybe he was under the influence of something, But whatever he believed he saw had left him completely terrified. I didn't see what he saw, but I was convinced he believed it was real.